Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. My name is Max and this is the Pentax 17, and you might wonder again. Let me explain briefly. So I recently did two larger trips and had to decide, as always for these kinds of trips, which camera to bring. And the first one was a business trip to New York City, and I was kind of hoping that I might be able to shoot some photographs in between meetings and workshops on site, basically in the evening and early morning and so on. And because of that, I wanted to bring a very light and small camera and settled on the Pentax 17 with only two rolls of film, a Kodak ProImage 100 and an Ilford Delta 400. And then right afterwards, I went on vacation to Tokyo, a trip that I had highly anticipated and of course put some thought into which cameras to bring, and I ended up, among other cameras, to bring the Pentax 17 again. So by now I have a large set of images from these two trips, and I also thought, okay, the camera had been released about 6 months ago in June 2024, and it kind of feels a good moment to take a fresh look at this camera and how it grew on me in the last 6 months. Because honestly, it grew on me much more than I anticipated. There are certain things I also learned about the camera and noticed that might be worth sharing. That kind of complement nicely my original 38-minute review that I did on the camera. I know it's a long one, but if you haven't seen it yet, I would recommend going back to this one first and then watching this one here. And I also believe that we as a film community don't give Pentax enough credit for the kind of camera they've created with the Pentax 17, but also for the entire film camera project that they've set out to do. And because of that, I also wanted to take a fresh look at the Pentax 17 using these images. So as said, I had two rolls with me in New York and tried to capture kind of the early morning scenes before meetings and kind of evening scenes using the flash and all the things that the camera can cater to, really taking it through its paces. And in Tokyo, I ended up shooting 4 rolls of film, which is quite a bit with 72 frames per roll, as you can imagine. 3 rolls of Kodak Gold 200, which I rated at ISO 160, which I could conveniently do with the ISO settings built into the camera, so without any kind of exposure compensation, and 1 roll of Ilford Delta 100. As always, these films were scanned and developed by my trusted On Film Lab in Frankfurt, so shout out to them. I can highly recommend their services. And without further ado, let's dive in there and take a closer look at the results and, most importantly, a fresh look at the Pentax 17. The Pentax 17 is a wonderful travel companion in my opinion. It's very light, it fits almost every bag, also a laptop bag for work. It gets you 72 frames out of a traditional roll, and the image quality is fantastic. In my opinion, there's no compromise. That was heavily debated in the past, but from my perspective, it's just a wonderful camera. As mentioned in my original review, the handling is quite intuitive, and I would say from today's perspective that grip is one of the best ones out there. You have a really nice and tight grip with that camera, plus the wrist strap is very, very nice. And yet I wanted to address 3 contentious issues that came up when the camera was first released and that kind of stuck to the camera until now, and that I believe need some reassessment. The first one is zone focusing. Why does the camera not have autofocus but only zone focusing? And here, my perspective by now is that you can certainly get used to the zone focusing, and it's quite intuitive in terms of its handling. All you need to understand and to memorize are the different distances to your subject in meters or feet, and you can always look them up on the downside of the lens. And then you have to understand how the different modes of the camera operate. And just taking the auto mode, of course, you have to understand depth of field for focusing accurately. So in other words, if you have a more sensitive ISO 400 or even ISO 800 film and you have a lot of sunlight available, the automatic mode will, of course, stop down your aperture, close the aperture, and ensure that a larger part of your frame will be in focus. So that results in making it significantly easier to focus correctly. On the other hand, if you're using an ISO 50 or 100 film and you don't have so much light available, then the camera is likely to open up the aperture to its maximum, to f3.5, and your depth of field will be shallower, and that as a result requires a more accurate estimate to your the distance to your subject. And understanding that can significantly impact how accurately you focus. And if you look at my images here, I typically didn't have any problems. Maybe sometimes in the closer distances I wasn't completely sure and then just took 2 images. And sometimes it happened to me if I was really exciting for street shots and so on, that I simply forgot to focus quickly and accurately, and then I typically realized right afterwards and took another shot, knowing that the 72 frames wouldn't hurt too much. The second contentious issue that came up a lot was the maximum shutter speed being limited to 1/350th of a second. And I saw many original reviews of the camera that featured blurry images, not just because people were unable to focus, but also they were simply moving too fast when taking the shot. So of course you have to hold the camera steady, but it doesn't mean that it is limiting. It's just a typical thing that you do with the camera when you want a sharp image and you don't want like a painterly impression, but rather something that is spot on. And it just takes you about a second to hold still, take that shot, and then regardless of whether the camera chooses 1/60th of a second or 1/350th of a second, it will be in focus and it will be sharp. And this is kind of important, and also it's important to understand how, again, your selected mode and the available light and so on will affect your image when it comes to that. So again, if you have a lot of light available, the auto mode is likely to use the maximum. If you have little light available, then it's more recommendable to hold particularly still, because it might choose a slower shutter speed as well. And then of course there's this warning light where it's telling you, hey, I will select the slower shutter speed, please hold particularly still. Or hey, I will introduce the flash now to give you a little bit of fill light and make it better. The third contentious issue that came up and that still stuck to the camera is that the way the marketing described the camera, it was very much catering to the needs of a younger generation of film shooters, potentially people who've never used it before, and who want to get started, get Instagrammable images that are already vertical and that they can share easily. And one commentator recently really hit the nail on its head when he said, I kind of disagree on that, because I feel like the camera offers us all the things that we as enthusiasts, as vintage film camera collectors typically want from a camera. And this argument really grew on me, and I realized, this is exactly why I like it so much. Precisely because you manually focus, you manually advance the film, you manually put it in and then advance the film. You kind of have to make a decision regarding the exposure mode. You can use exposure compensation, you can or have to manually rewind the film. All the stuff that is kind of nice about shooting a film camera is there, and yet you have an automatic exposure mode that kind of takes away a little bit of the nuisance if you don't want a meter and so on. And this I found really, really interesting, because at the end of the day you can argue, no, this is not a camera that is only catering to the needs of a certain younger generation, but it's also the kind of camera where we feel at home as enthusiasts. And personally, I can really say this comment really resonated with me, because I found myself realizing this is why I pick the camera up so often, and it's more likely that I pick it up for such a city trip in comparison to a fully automatic camera like a typical point and shoot from the 90s, because I have so much more control with it, and that is what gives me joy when taking photographs. And then there's the lens, a 25mm f3.5 lens that is the equivalent in terms of its focal length of a 37mm on a traditional full-frame 35mm camera. When the camera was originally introduced, many people complained that it's only a 3 elements and 3 groups design, so a classic triplet. And yet, if you look at the images and the results and how the modern coding comes into play, you can really see how fantastic this lens is, at least from my perspective. You can easily shoot directly into the sun, and you not only get a beautiful look and effect, but you also have hardly any ghosting or flaring. In general, all the images get sharp across the entire frame. You get a beautiful character despite the relatively small negative. And personally, I also really like these colors, especially the ones that I got here in New York and also to some extent in Tokyo. It really captures nicely the kind of atmosphere that I had and can also deal nicely with harsh sunlight and similar situations. The only thing that I sometimes wished for is to have something that is closer to a 50mm or 55mm equivalent in terms of focal length, but maybe this is something that they can do in a future version of the camera. As I mentioned in my original review, I sometimes found myself accidentally turning the mode dial, and I now realize that the problem is that I use my thumb to kind of put it underneath the film advance lever to kind of stabilize my grip, and I then realized this is a habit that I picked up with my Leica M6, because here you use your thumb and the lever to activate the light meter, the built-in one, and you typically carry the camera around like that. This is a habit that is completely unnecessary on this particular camera. It actually ends up or results sometimes in switching the mode dial without really wanting it. So this is the habit I really need to let go of when using this camera. On the other hand, here, just looking at New York, this short trip gave me 144 photographs out of 2 rolls of film. So as I've indicated earlier, it's tremendous what you can do with this camera. It was super light carrying it. It was super nice having it around. You get this high quality feel out of it. Of course, it's not a vintage camera. It doesn't have the charm or the feeling of a Leica M2 or Leica M3 or something like that from the 50s, but it doesn't have to. And this is also where my perspective changed. Right now, I would say this is the kind of camera that can be your only film camera. So if you're a digital shooter, you could just say, yeah, nice, let's get this one film camera and take it out when I want to capture or document my day-to-day life, or want to go take it on a trip and have some really nice film images with beautiful color, just to throw one roll of Kodak Portrait in there and use it for a couple of weeks even, and then get some really nice results out of this. This is the kind of camera that you could use for just that, and you get the modern reliability, you get everything you can expect from a modern camera in terms of coding, handling, material, lightweight, and so on. No hassle, no cleaning, and so. Or you could say you are a vintage film camera collector, like many people watching, and you can easily complement your collection with that modern camera. In a similar fashion, like a vintage watch collector, for instance, would complement his collection or her collection with a modern watch as well. You could certainly do that, and it doesn't have to be a modern Leica MA or a Leica MP that costs a fortune, but you could just say, hey, I also want to have this in my collection because it gives me a different feel, a different reliability, and so on, and sometimes it's something that I'm drawn to. And this is what I realized personally, that I really like having it in my collection, and that depending on the mood of the day, depending on my outfit and how I feel, this is the camera I feel drawn to and that I pick up. And maybe it's similar for you. There are 2 more things that I want to mention. It's also a fantastic second camera to carry around. So I did this, for instance, in Tokyo when I was also shooting my Minolta X-T7. We will get to that in a later video. And I could just have the camera dangling on the wrist strap around my hand and then have 2 hands free to operate another camera. So it's really nice to carry it as a second camera where you say, oh, these kinds of shots I take with the Pentax 17 and other kinds of shots I take with a medium format camera or a full frame 35mm camera. And last but not least, I really noticed, especially when shooting it in New York and Tokyo, how unobtrusive the camera is, and that people mostly perceive you as a tourist who's taking casual shots. And then of course you get these kinds of shots out of it that are surprisingly good in terms of quality, and you can really create some beautiful, even artful pictures with it. And I was really surprised by it. And as I've mentioned before here, some of my New York images have a lot of feeling, a lot of character. I could easily imagine doing a nice print out of this one and then putting it on a wall because of the kind of feeling that it conveys. And this, I think, is unusual, to have a camera that is so unobtrusive, so small and nice and light, and yet can create these kinds of results. So again, kudos to Pentax for creating this beautiful little thing that, at least in my collection, fits perfectly and complements all the vintage cameras that I have. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this additional video on the Pentax 17 and my thoughts after 6 months of using it on a regular basis. And you can kind of tell how it grew on me and how I've changed my perspective on it a little bit and nuances, and how these complement my original review. I haven't changed my mind, but it kind of grew on me even more. And I would also encourage you to always take a step back and look at the big picture and what the Pentax 17 represents for Pentax and us as a film community. And this is also why I'm closely following the Pentax film photography Instagram channel, because I feel like this is where the real news will be happening pretty soon. And this is what all of us should be monitoring, because the next 2 cameras that Pentax is likely to release will probably change the conversation around film photography and heavily impact us as a community. You can already tell with the Pentax 17 how it affects having a certain film camera collection, how it also might affect vintage prices, how in this particular case half-frame cameras are all the rage again, how many people are looking in the vintage direction but also the modern direction with Pentax 17. And there will be more cameras, and just saying this in 2024 and having a positive resume after the first 6 months of this camera being on the market is incredible in my opinion. And I'm really grateful to experience this, being really into film photography, and seeing this revival and being part of it with the channel and all this is just really beautiful. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. I hope to see you soon. Thanks for watching.